I've been a blacksmith armorer for over 30 years. I've created weapons for over 200 feature films. This is Man at Arms. I asked you guys what you wanted. You said you wanted the Zenith sword from League of Legends, and I made it happen for you. To extrapolate an unfeasible, oversized design and make it into a real weapon is always difficult. Normally for video game builds, we'll make the blades out of 70-75 aircraft aluminum. In this case, we're using 5160 spring steel. Made a paper pattern and traced it out. I had a 42-inch long blade, about 4 inches wide. That was in turn transferred to a piece of 5160 spring steel that was 1/4 inch thick. We cut that out with the bandsaw to the outside profiles, and then I forged the tang to a longer length and to the thickness that I needed. I've also patterned out the aluminum spikes that come off of the donut at the hilt, and those are cut out of 1 inch thick 70-75 aluminum. We've threaded those with a 1024 threaded insert, and that'll thread into the donut when I spread that open. I've taken a 9-inch length of Delrin plastic, drilled a hole through it, and that'll be the grip for the sword. The difference between blacksmithing and machining is if I try to drill a 1/4 inch hole in 1/4 inch material through the side, it's going to split the material. With blacksmithing, I can punch and drift out the hole, giving enough space, and that's kind of what I did with cutting a slot, opening it up to a round, and then spreading the round out to give it the donut for the hilt. After Brian had drilled the 3 holes to attach the aluminum donuts, there's one section of the 5160 steel blade that was still too hard, so we had to anneal the hilt. Annealing is a process where we heat it up to the critical temperature, which is about 1500 to 1600 degrees, and then put it into vermiculite, which is like an expanded mica, to allow it to slow cool so that a regular drill bit would be able to drill through the metal. We've hole sawed some pieces of 3/4 inch thick aluminum and cut out the profiles of that. And then Brian has drilled 4 1/4 inch holes around the perimeter that the 2 aluminum donuts will be riveted on there. I've also taken a big ingot of bronze and forged it to the pommel. I also punched a hole through the middle of the bronze pommel, and then we took a square punch and punched it into like a diamond shape in the middle. I cracked it in a couple places because bronze is not really a material that's conducive to hot forging, so it got a little bit too hot and separated, but it does weld very easily, so I was able to TIG weld it with bronze welding rod and got everything cleaned up. There was an imperfection. The welding made it perfect again. I've done some detail work on the exterior of the bronze pommel. Brian will be working on the interior kind of file work on that with a die grinder and a carbide bit, opening up everything, so that's looking really nice. I took a long length of 1.5-inch diameter Delrin plastic, drilled a hole through the middle on the lathe, and then hand carved a spiral flute into it. I've wrapped the piece with black leather, and I'm going to inlay twisted silver wire up into the grooves. I know the one from the game doesn't actually have that type of handle, but it just kind of lends itself to it. I started grinding the bevels on the blade. We tapered down the tang and threaded that to 3/8 of an inch in diameter with 16 threads per inch. The discs for the donuts have been turned on the lathe. We're going to clean that up, and to insert the side spikes, I had Alicia cut some slots with the separating disc with the abrasive cutoff saw, and we TIG welded a coupling nut in there so we can actually screw the piece in. Just pulled it out of the electric heat treating oven at about 1550 degrees and quenched it in heat treating oil. That gives the full hardness. And then we put it back into the heat treating ovens to about 600 degrees, allowing it to temper so it toughens the metal. The Zenith sword was a lot of work, but it's all done. It's a very technical piece to make, and I put my feel to it, changing the pommel and the grip around, but it was a balanced working piece. I was pretty happy with it. What was particularly cool about this project, the designer of the weapon was Michael from Riot Games, and he was able to come out and see the finished piece realized.
Oh my god! Oh my god! I get to hold it. Oh! This is amazing. This is literally what I imagined, simply because I imagined this way back in the day, and I drew it, and we put it in a video game, but now here it is in my hand, and that is an experience beyond words. We have, teams of dudes, of modelers, concept artists, visual effects artists, splash artists that make these characters themselves. Well, it's not just one guy. So this is an amazing thing for any of them to see. Protect the faith.
Once again on Man at Arms, we're returning to League of Legends. We're going to build the nameless blade of Yasuo the Unforgiven.
This sword is kind of an over-the-top katana build with some really fancy fittings. So obviously I have to hand this off to Ilya, who's going to do all the blade forging. We're going to do some really cool hollow forming techniques to do the guard and the pommel. And I think you guys are really going to like this build. To make the katana-like blade, we could start from much smaller stock and just go right to hand forging. But since we have large power hammer, we might as well start from a big cube of W1 and break it down. Ilya's gonna go from the forge straight to the hammer and get this thing out to a bar. It's gonna take him 3 or 4 heats, and then he'll be able to begin the blade forging. So there's a whole lot of different art. This piece of art, however, is quite pleasing to the eye and would function quite well as a sword. So what I've done is I've traced the whole outline of this guard and all the details. I then pulled it out here and then separated everything. These are our 2 base parts. This is an overlay that'll get sculpted and then welded onto here, one on each side. This overlay here will go on this base part, get sculpted, one on each side as well, and then all these parts will get welded as one solid object. Now what I have to do is trace the outside of our pommel. We're gonna cut our pommel out of close to an inch thick material, and then I'm gonna do a whole lot of sculpting on the sander afterwards, but there's our perimeter, scaled to the same size as the guard pieces, ready to cut. To create the guard for this sword, there are a lot of different options. What I've chosen to do, since Ilya's busy, is we're gonna do a bunch of different overlays. We're gonna layer them all up, we're gonna sculpt them before we weld them together, and that's gonna give us our depth and really give you that nice organic feel. Let's cut our parts. Starting at the shoulder, Ilya begins to do the hand beveling on the edge. He'll work his way all the way to the tip, and then he'll define that area as well. Unlike a lot of the other katana builds, this doesn't have a defined kasaki. It kind of just rounds up to the tip, so he doesn't have to worry about that part at all. Alright, Ilya did a great job forging this big blade. I say big blade, I guess as far as man-at-arms blades go. It's not that large, but as far as katanas are, this thing is a beast. But my job right now is just to hog some material off, get the edge a little thinner. We're gonna leave it slightly thick so it's safe for that heat treat. We are gonna clay this and give it a hamon. And there's a fuller down the back, which we haven't done on a katana yet. I'm not gonna do that before heat treat though. I'm just gonna take a little material off the edge and do some profile grinding and hand it to Ilya for heat treat.
I'm about to apply clay to Yasuo's blade. Matt asked me to produce a flamboyant hamon that's reminiscent of blood splatter to recapitulate the story of Yasuo. However, before I do any of that, I'd like to show you something. This blade right here is my personal one that I'm working on. This is made from traditional material, Tamahagani from Japan. Quite a bit smaller than Yasuo's blade over here. You also notice that it is straight. That is because traditional materials like being water quenched. In the water quench, the blade first curves this way and then establishes its final curve as it completely cools off. That phenomenon is not present when we're quenching the steel in oil, as we're going to do with Yasuo. As the blade cools off, it loses curvature. Because of that, I had to overcurve the blade in order to set up my final geometry after the quench.
So we have about 10 separate pieces that are going to make up our cloud motif guard. Each individual one has to be drastically sculpted to give it an organic shape and feel. I'm going to start with this piece here, kind of looks like a little dagger. I got to edge it just like I would a knife. Then I got to round out this whole scroll piece, and then we'll see how it all fits together. After I get this piece rounded and this piece edged, I'm going to use this piece, and I got to do some cut-in work. It's a little trickier sculpting. After grinding a whole lot of detail and depth in my overlays, I'm now going to add some texture to the background using a planishing hammer. I think this looks a lot like clouds, and it's a lot more pleasing to the eye. Alright, we have all of our pieces now prepped and ready for welding. We now are going to start constructing the guard. You can see we have a sword shape opening right here. First panel is our wing-like section that goes here. And then what I'd like to call our yataghan plate. Put our overlays on top. And that's basically how it's going to look. Very fluid, very natural. Super happy with this. I'm just going to tack everything in place. Start off, flip it over, tack the other side together. And then we'll do all the structural welding around the perimeter.
Because of how shallow our heat treating forge is, Ilya is going to have to be very careful with this large sweeping blade. He's going to keep it in the air so that he doesn't bump off any of the clay. Once this piece has a nice even heat over the entire length, he'll bring it out and go into the oil quench.
Now that the blade has been heat treated and tempered, I can go ahead and finalize the geometry and then move on to the polishing grits. I'm gonna start at 24 grit and then move all the way through. For the sake of time, I'm just gonna do one side so that we can get a quick peek at the hamon. After sanding the blade all the way through 400 grit, it's now time to move on to Scotch-Brite. Now that I've Scotch-Brited the blade, you can really see that hamon pops in the light. Billy really went out of his way to make it look like blood splatter and water. I think he did a great job. Alright, we have our guard all welded together. I'm gonna go ahead and start blending off that weld, and where the seams show through, I'll just go back and weld a little more, blend a little more. And I know this is a little out of order, but let's go ahead and get a sneak peek of what this looks like on the blade, because I am excited. Dude, looks perfect. I'll just go back here, add a little weld so it stops on the shoulder so it doesn't keep sliding.
We're now getting ready to cut the pommel for our League of Legends build. We're going to cut it out of a piece of 3/4 inch mild steel. The basic design of the pommel and guard are based on a Japanese cloud style motif. So we're going to cut the perimeter in our CNC plasma, and then Matt will sculpt it to shape to give it that cloud pattern.
All right, John's cut me out the perimeter of our pommel. You can see I drew in there with a Sharpie some details. I'm gonna use the corner of this sander and this sander mostly, but we're just gonna go ahead and get to sculpting. The thing I have to focus on the most is doing the correct order of operations, because it has so much depth and layered. If I sculpt one first that needs to be lower than the other, so on and so forth. Probably gonna hand it off to Ference at the very end to do the inside of this curl, just because I don't have a wheel that's small enough to get in there and do that.
The Scotch-Brite wheel that we use on this machine looks like it's very hard. It's actually a soft wheel that does an extremely good job of blending and polishing forms. John now wraps the cord over the handle. This will both give an ornamentation and a much firmer grip. Scurry back to your shadows, ninja. Everyone faces a reckoning.
click here to subscribe or click here to watch more episodes. Thanks for watching Man-at-Arms Reforged. We need to know what you want the guys to build, so tell us in the comments below what weapons you want to see next.
Once again on Man-at-Arms, we're returning to League of Legends. This time to take out some of my frustration when I'm playing and I get knocked all the way back to spawn by Poppy's hammer.
It's known as the Hammer of Orlan. See a few artist renditions, and then I went ahead and did a full-scale drawing of how big this thing is going to be. About 21 inches long and maybe 14 inches square, 5.5 feet tall perhaps. I'll do a sheet metal skin over top of a skeleton superstructure. These are my overlays, and here I have some bevels. I'll make the actual hammer face out of hardenable alloy and we'll heat treat it. Now that I know what I'm going to build and approximately how I'm going to do it, well, I want to go ahead and get all my ideas and drawings put into the CAD system so we can cut our parts out and start putting it together.
Since we have to make 8 of the same part, 4 for each end of the hammer, John's going to do it on the CNC plasma where it's easy to replicate parts. To make sure these pieces will fit correctly, John goes to the sander and cleans up the outside edges. Now that the surrounds are finished, John's going to tack weld these to the face. They'll be welded on solid prior to heat treating. For the faces, we've used 4130 steel. It's a very versatile material that allows us to quench in water or to quench in oil. In this case, we're going to use water because we have a much larger quenching barrel.
Now that my end plates are heat treated, I went ahead and cut the cages off and started to wire wheel the fire scale. This one I need to finish. Now that my end caps are finished, I went ahead and fabricated some square sections out of some half-by stock. We'll go ahead and place them on, line them up, tack them into place, and it's going to look much like this piece here.
This not only is going to add some rigidity, but also creates that border look that you see in the game.
Having already cut these panels on the plasma, John now goes to the Diacro roller to force them to the proper form. He'll check them against each other to make sure that they match.
Getting the body of this hammer welded together is a two-man job. You'll see here that I'm laying into the pieces, keeping them together, as John tack welds slowly down the corners. You have to make sure that everything stays nice and square or his end caps won't fit on right.
Now that the main body sides are tack welded in place, we're going to fit it to the end to see how it looks before we finish welding up the seams. I can go ahead and measure for the internal cage that I need to build, which will hold the handle from the inside.
So I've got a couple of pieces that need some form off the lathe that are going to go onto the handle for Poppy's hammer. It's going to have a ramp cut in that goes down near the pommel. And then we've also got this piece that we're going to be cutting on that's got a step cut in. You'll see it at the top of the handle area. And after these are welded in place, then we'll do all the rest of the finishing on it.
In John's previous big builds, we've usually gone with a painted surface, but in this case, we don't want to do that, so John removes a little material to polish that surface so we can prep it to acid black it later. Now that he's done welding everything on the inside, he's going to put that panel back in place and weld it shut. Using a hand grinder, John smooths out the finish on the bottom of the hammer.
John's now given me a couple of additional pieces to fit for him. In this case, I've taken this plate and cut a rectangular hole. I'll now be fitting the actual pommel up inside of it like a mortise and tenon.
To get the depth and the relief on our pommel piece, John's going to construct it from several different pieces. First, he's got to add a peaked ridge to the center oval. So we have quite a few pieces on this hammer that have to get brass colored. We made them in steel. Now I'm gonna use the torch, heat them up to about a plum color, then use a brass wire wheel that will deposit the brass color on the surface.
Okay, the next step is I had to figure out my big side overlay here for the hammerhead. So I went ahead and did a full-scale sketch of what I want it to look like. And from here, we went ahead and put it into the AutoCAD, and we're getting ready to cut the parts out now.
Just like you saw John sculpt the central peak on the small oval on the pommel, now I have to do it on a large scale for the overlay on the body.
All right, I've got the first 3 holes drilled in my bottom support plate. I'm going to go ahead and drill the final one, and then we can weld the parts in.
Now that the body of our hammer is constructed, it's time to add some detail. We're going to be achieving this look by adding on overlays. These overlays will mostly be cut on the CNC plasma. With the overlays cut out and cleaned up, John now forms them and welds them to the sides.
The next thing to do is to make the leather top covering here. So I took some measurements, transferred it to paper, made a pattern. Now we're going to put it on the leather, trace it, cut it out, and we'll go see if it fits.
Now that John has his leather patterns completely cut out, it's time to dye them and get them the right color. He's going to do this all by hand. He's going to rub it on. We don't want it to look completely uniform. We want it to look aged. So he's going to take his time, get that right effect, and then we'll be able to put it on the hammer itself.
We're going for a distressed surface on this hammer. To create that, we're going to be using a metal blackening compound on all of the steel surfaces.
Everything is finally starting to come together now. I'm ready for the final stages, and I'm really excited, and I can't wait to see it in the demos.
This hammer is so huge, I doubt we'll be able to even fit it on the anvil for the beauty shots. Something this large is quite unwieldy without the magic it takes to make it work.
Step right up! Come one, come all to the Man-at-Arms Hammer Ball! Let me show you how it's done.
So if you've been watching our League of Legends builds before and we've talked about playing, you'll know that I mostly play ARAMs. When you're playing ARAMs, that one champ you don't want to see on the other team, especially from a competent player, is Master Yi.
To create Master Yi's blade, I'll be using 3.5 inches of 4140 stock. I'll be knocking this down, getting it down to a bar form using the Nazel power hammer. It'll take me about a half an hour to get it down to a bar, and then we'll work from there.
Now that Carrie's done a lot of the brute forging and really broken down this round stock into a nice long bar, Billy is going to take over from here and start forging the blade. He's going to continue drawing it out. He's going to work on both the flat and on the sides to make sure everything stays nice and true as he draws it out. Here you can clearly see where Ilya is spraying water onto the blade as he's working and the scales popping from the surface. The reason we want that scale to pop off is it can leave really deep pits in the metal. We have a really limited amount of material to work from this time. We got to make a pretty large blade, so we can't afford any loss. See now, Ilya is turning that symmetrical point that he forged in into the more Tanto katana-like point that we're used to seeing in the game art. You've seen Ilya do very similar work on the Kill Bill katana episode. Ilya has quickly become one of the major masters in this country at forging super large blades. Not too many people even take those commissions. Many customers come asking all different sword makers if they'll make super huge large blades like you guys request. Ilya has now forged more than probably any of them in this country, maybe worldwide. He's quickly become a master, and it's fun to watch him work. At this point, Ilya is removing the handle section so that he can define the tang. Doesn't need that handle in there for leverage anymore now that the blade's drawn out so long. He's flipped it over. He's using a hot cut tool underneath the power hammer. He's just going to remove that material, allow him to forge that section. Now that the power hammer work is done on this blade, Ilya's going to move to the anvil and start forging in the bevels. You can see as he works to get these really steep bevels, he's working on the very edge of the anvil. This is so that when he holds that blade at an angle and strikes it matching that angle, he doesn't hit the face of the anvil, dinging it or possibly chipping the anvil. To give you guys a sense of time, Ilya's been hand beveling now for about an hour. He's now at the point where he's joining the tip bevel into the shoulder bevel. He's got about a 6-inch section to go. This is a long process, takes about 20 heats to get the bevel forged in on a big blade like this. So he's just gonna stay at it, and then I'll be ready to do the grinding. Now that the forging is done, it's time to start the grinding. I have a few things I gotta work out before I start. This is a hybrid between a katana. The Chinese ring swords are very flimsy and very light, used in traditional forms. Japanese katana is very thick and has very prominent edges. So I have to do a blend of the both. I'm gonna start by profiling just slightly and then start on those heavy bevels.
Today I've been working on the League of Legends ring sword, and I'm doing the rings that are going to hang from the sword. We're going to do them out of bronze, and we decided to do them as the stylized snake that's eating its tail. Now I'm in the process of carving the scales on it, and once the scales are carved on it, we'll cast it in bronze and then finish it tomorrow. And any place where I've lost the scales, I'll be able to put them back on with a chasing tool.
We'll be doing these castings with lost wax. First we take the waxes and sprue them into a tree, then they're set into a flask and plaster is poured around them. It's a special plaster called investment. It'll go into the kiln, be slowly ramped up to 1350, lowered to 1000. It'll be placed into the casting machine, and then I'm going to bring in molten 2100 degree bronze and pour it into the vacuum machine. After it reaches 900 degrees, we'll take it to the water. It'll steam off the investment and show us our bronze.
The last step before heat treating the blade is to get those holes located and drilled in where our rings will go afterwards. Now that we got our blade ready for heat treating, it's time to move on to the guard portion. Just like in some previous League of Legends builds, the splash art doesn't always match with the in-game art, so I've had to do a little figuring out, see where I want to go with this guard. This is the main splash art for Master Yi for his basic standard skin, and this is what we've based our design off so far. Unfortunately, all the pictures I can find of it have that guard and the blade off angle, so what I had to do is kind of zoom in here, take a good look at everything, and I kind of just freehand drew what I thought the guard would look like. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to mirror it over from the center point here. Just got to fill in a few lines. So the blade will come out of this section Probably gonna set a stone or something like that in the middle, cut some overlays to make those borders rise out, and be good to go. So we have 6 different pieces that make up this guard. We got our central wings, we have the quoin block, and then the outer pieces, which are gonna make it look like a nice raised border. What I have to do now is I gotta take both of these quoin block pieces and center at the blade.
I'm about to heat treat Master Yi's sword, his dada, hammer bits, hammer dies, and other impact tools. 4140 has approximately 0.4% carbon, means I don't have to watch my temperatures as carefully as some other higher carbon steels, but it has tons of manganese and tons of chrome in it. This means if I would try to hamon this blade, it would not show any hamon because it's a deep hardening steel and the quench goes all the way under the clay to the spine.
Ilya now goes into our long furnace, brings this piece up to critical temperature to where it's non-magnetic, brings it out, and takes it to the quench.
So, I quench Master Yi's dada. It is at full hardness now, however, because it's 4140, it doesn't get hard as the high carbon steels. Check this sound out. It doesn't have that glassy sound because it's 4140. Its highest hardness I can get on this blade in an oil quench is about, let's say 55, 51 Rockwell. The highest hardness I can get out of 1075, 1095 can be up to 60, 61 Rockwell in an oil quench. Now we're ready. In the tempering, this is actually the last opportunity to straighten out any warps produced in the quench. So I'm going to take it out and go to the vise to quickly yank some of them straight. So Master Yi's sword is basically straight. Any other warping along the edge will be fixed in the grind when it's been made sharp.
Now that we have Master Yi's Wushu blade completely heat treated and tempered, I can move on to the polishing. My first goal is to start at the 80 grit and Alright, so I just ran this blade through the grits, 120, 220. I got a little more polishing to do before I move on to the Scotch-Brite, but I was able to define that Kawasaki, which is where the 2 different bevels come together. I added a small back bevel on the spine. Just think it looks a little more aggressive and I like it. I'm really happy with it so far. Time to get that hilt and the pommel on.
The pommel for Master Yi's sword will be constructed from 3 pieces of black iron pipe and a couple pieces of round bar that'll be forged into 2 arrowhead finials. When forging finials like this, the preform is very important. So I'm going to take the piece of this round bar and I'm going to flatten it out. And then I'm going to form 2 shoulders. And then using the edge of the anvil, I'm going to buck that shape to get a shape like this. And then from there, I'll bevel them and draw that point more. And then it'll get cleaned up to look like that. So 1, 2, 3.
So for the pommel on Master Yi, Sam's already forged out a couple of the points that go to the left and right. I'm going to be basically turning a spike out the top, and then we'll probably do some faceting on it to get it to fit. It'll lock down into a pipe section that'll become the main part of the pommel. All of that's going to get welded solid, and that'll hold the whole sword together.
For the construction on our pommel, we're going to use 2 pieces of pipe. One's going to get a notch in it, the other a V. They're going to be put together and welded solid. I start by cutting the 2 pieces of pipe on the saw, then I move to the sander to sand in the notch in the V shape that will allow these 2 pieces of pipe to join together. What we have is a cross pipe with a notch in it, and a top pipe with a V in it. It's going to get welded solid. Then we have these nice arrowheads that Sam forged, and then the lathe turn spike that Carrie did, it'll go in the top. Now that the base of our guard is polished out, it's time to add those borders on. John's going to use the MIG welder and weld all the way around the perimeter, and then he's going to move to the sanders and blend that weld off. With time winding down, the pressure's on. No time for us to go one at a time, so while John's fastening the pommel, I blend the welds on the guard.
We're going to put some bright green paint into the background on this piece. But before that, the entire piece has to be brassed because that's going to be the highlight on the raised sections and all the way around the border. After preheating the guard, Sam takes a solid brass wire wheel and runs it over the surface. The friction from the wire wheel and the preheat on the material lays the brass permanently onto the guard. So for the handle on Master Yi, we've got this small flange that mounts here that goes on top of the guard. I'm going to be cutting that on the lathe. Just a couple of steps in here, and then we'll take it over to the mill and make a larger slot to go over the tang. I use a 3/8 cutter on the Gorton mill to make a slot where I had placed a hole using the lathe. So we have a small area that we've cut. It's about a 1/2 inch. These are 12mm stones. I'm going to be setting sterling silver bezels in place. Then we'll drop the stones into them afterwards. Using a torch, low temperature solder, about 500 degrees here, and an acid-based flux that's going to burn that surface nice and clean for us. As soon as I feel like I'm getting the heat, I'm going to put a little bit of solder in the bottom, pick up the bezels, put a little flux on the bezel and drop them right onto the solder, and they should adhere perfectly. Afterwards, I'll use a bezel pusher to lay in the edge and keep the stone in place.
It's time to move on to our handle portion. The handle on Master Yi's sword is a very long spiraled handle. It's in 2 parts, but I'm going to make my job easier by leaving it 1 part to start with. Then I'll go on the sanding belt and get her carved up. Alright, those of you that are League of Legends fans know that Master Yi's sword glows green. To create that green, we've added a couple gemstones, but I also am going to paint the inside of our recess on the guard neon green.
So we're closing in on Master Yi. The sword's fully assembled now. We're going to put the rings in. We've got to do some polishing. We'll go back over the paint. The handle has to be finished out. It's gold, so this ring will have to be golden as well. And then we'll be finished with the entire sword. Really excited to do a League of Legends build. We both play on a regular basis. It took us a little while to decide which champion's weapon to build. Katarina won out.
The first thing we have to do is get Katarina's blades drawn and cut out. The in-game art changes a little bit on Katarina. We had to do a lot of research between some of our other skins and some fan art. We're gonna make 2 of them. We're gonna make them pretty big. They're called knives or daggers in the game, but they're basically a short sword.
We have John use the CNC plasma to cut out the blades for Katarina's sinister steel attack. John cleans and deburrs the blades. They'll have to have a fairly good finish so that we can do the engraving and not have to do a lot of surface finishing afterwards.
Went ahead and laid out the engraving for the inside of the blade. You can see it's going to be pretty gnarly. So what I need to give Kerry is delete the outside of the blade and just give him this file. It'll give him his tool path and he'll be able to put that into the CNC mill and get it carved.
For Katarina's daggers, we're actually going to do some deeper carving. It's not just going to be engraving. The CNC milling machine is going to take 4 passes. We're going to go about 40 thousandths deep. This will give us a basic layout and give us the definition for where the edges are going to end.
So we're going to do a little side build on the Katarina swords. We're going to make 3 throwing daggers that she carries. We're going to use 1075 steel because it's a great all-around tough steel for that kind of weapon. Ah! Safety first!
Sam first cuts them on the saw, then deburrs them, and goes outside to begin the forging.
I've been throwing knives since I was a kid, and it's just been always something I enjoyed. Now I get that chance to make them. That's one of the things that originally got me into blacksmithing and knife making was learning how to make weapons, because I've lost a lot of time storing knives, throwing them around the woods and stuff over the years. So now I get to make my own, and as many as I need. There's an old bladesmith saying, 10 minutes in the forge beats 2 hours at the grinder. You can see, taking time and care to forge these really close to finish, I only have about a few minutes on the grinder.
He starts at the 24 grit and moves all the way through the grits to 220. After grinding, Sam heat treats and then tempers Katarina's throwing darts.
Here the 3 throwing knives have come out of the temper oven where we tempered them at 450 degrees.
Got the blade back from engraving, looks awesome. Only thing we need to do is stick it in the forge, draw out the edge a little bit. I just want to see a little more thickness here. So I'm gonna go ahead and edge bevel it and prepare it for grinding. In the game, all the edges, all the way around the blade are all beveled and sharp, so I'm gonna go ahead and get to grinding on that. What I like to use is a pair of vice grips, clamp those on the tang. Not only am I hooking my thumb in the wheel to get some leverage, but I can master. This is getting to be pretty exciting, looking really wicked. It's gonna cause a lot of damage in the demo. It's now time to move on to heat treat. I'm gonna pass them off to Kerry to do that, and then Kerry's gonna quench into water.
Using our CNC plasma table, I'm going to cut out the guards for Katarina's swords from League of Legends.
After Kerry and I examined a lot of in-game art and some fan art, we decided this guard needs some overlays. John used a plasma cutter to cut them out.
So I'm going to use the fly press to do some of the ornamentation for the guards for Katarina. I'm actually marking where we're going to be drilling for some rivets. I'll come in with a chisel and just lay in the 4 lines that you see on opposite sides of her guard.
John lines up the guard and the overlay to drill the rivet holes. Using a domed rivet set in the vise, Sam rivets the overlays to the guard base.
Now that the overlay and guard are already assembled, John's going to mount them, slot them, and check the fit on the tang of the swords.
I left the edges a little thick for heat treat, but now that we have the blades hardened, it's time to hone those in. I do that on the 24 grit machine. It's now time to polish these beautiful blades. I start at 120, move to a 280, and then on to Scotch-Brite before buffing. John welds the guard and pommel onto the first blade. This gives us our first look at Katarina's deadly blades.
While researching these weapons, I actually had to add Katarina as a champion. I'd only played her in randoms. Now that I have more understanding of how these weapons work, I'll certainly be playing her more.
We're really excited to be doing another League of Legends build. This time, we're going to be doing Diana's Evil Crescent Blade. In Season 4, we made Leona's sword, which draws its power from the sun, while Diana's blade is the exact inverse. It draws its power from the moon. Our brother was the lead software engineer for the Elcross mission that was actually crashed into the moon. Carrie and I's name, along with his, were engraved on the inside panel of that satellite, so I think we're the only swordsmiths on the planet that can claim that our name is on the moon. The inspiration behind Diana's Crescent Blade is obviously a traditional Egyptian khopesh. This is a lot different though, not only in the aggressive look of it, but in the sheer size of the overall piece. It's all solid steel. It's going to be a huge, really hard to wield blade. It's going to be a big challenge forging that shape from one solid piece, but I think we're up to the task and it's time to get it going. For Diana's huge sword, we decided to use a forklift fork to forge it out into our massive blade. But first we have to remove some of the anchors. That could be different steel. We definitely don't want to mix that in while forging, so Sam's going to use the plasma cutter and just knock these right off.
So we started with that forklift fork and it had big lugs on it. Sam cut them off with the plasma torch, but they've left some areas where there's a little bit of the lug left and there's some weld. Since we're going to forge this out, we want it to all be the same. I'm going to just rough grind them off with some 24 grit. To take the 90-degree bend out of the forklift fork, Ilya and Matt bring it up to temperature in the forge and straighten it in the hydraulic press.
At this point, we got rid of the obnoxious bend. Now, all we have to do is make it a bit broader, quite a bit longer, then we can lay out our blade pattern and begin the real forging.
Even with the large size of this forklift tine, you'll see the hammer move it very quickly. Ilya's going to really move this metal quite a bit. He's going to drive it down to thin it to give himself some width. He's going to be punching, cutting, and forming the entire piece.
Yeah, so we started off with a little set punch, set the holes, then we finished them off with a classic punch on the anvil. One of the struggles when doing punching holes in such thick material is your tools are going to heat up really fast, so you saw we got a little punch stuck here and there. No big deal, but that's just going to happen when you're punching through big thick material. We got two nice offset holes that will allow us to then cut in from there and to open up the khopesh and give us that big S-curve shape that we're looking for.
There's a couple of ways to create the form that we're trying to reach. One of which would be to overlap the materials, forge weld them, and kind of drive them back on themselves. Ilya's actually going to